Good evening. My name is David Griffiths. I am the lead candidate for Alliance for Unity in the West Scotland constituency. And just looking back over the last week, we have reached several new milestones. We've overtaken the Liberal Democrats in terms of social media following in just 4 weeks. They've been in social media for 11 years, just to give you a comparison. We've now amassed over 14,000 signatures for the Resign Sturgeon Change Organisation petition. And we've announced Councillor Linda Holt as our candidate in Mid-Scotland and Fife, which is a role she will undertake in addition to serving as our education spokesperson. If you want to stand, or if you want to find out more about standing for Alliance for Unity, you can obtain a candidate application pack if you email us on contact@alliance4unity.uk, or you can visit www.alliance4unity.uk, or you can ring us on 01389 504 534. So, this week's Alliance for Unity podcast is underway. George Galloway is busy after a very happy arrival at the weekend, so I've stepped in to take his place. So as I say, I'm David Griffiths, lead candidate for the West Scotland constituency, and as the accent probably tells you, I am from the west of Scotland, and I have lifelong links with the area. My father was an Ayrshirman, my mother came from Johnston, my brother, my sister and I were born in Eastwood, and we grew up and went to school just south of the constituency border in Troon. Both my children were born while we were living in East Renfrewshire, and now after living and working in England, in London and the North West for most of the last 20 years, I am in the process of moving back to the west of Scotland to live in the constituency in Ayrshire, which I've always considered my home. Unlike many of the vastly more politically experienced Alliance for Unity candidates, I have a background in business rather than politics. And just to briefly go through my background, I went to university in Glasgow in the 1980s, after which I spent many years working in information technology, primarily within the travel and aviation sectors. Latterly, I left full-time employment to start my own IT consultancy business, again, mainly, but not exclusively, working in those same sectors. Now, this was at a time, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, when the travel and aviation industries were pretty much on their knees, and following which many people were actually afraid to travel anywhere. And so as a result, I know exactly what it's like to work in an industry and in an economy in which there is very little money to spare, and in which all unnecessary excess spend has to be eliminated, which has been a very good life lesson. Moving on further, in 2015, I was diagnosed with a very serious illness, which meant I had to work from home for long periods, and on occasion I couldn't actually work at all. Luckily, with the grace of God, just before Christmas 2019, only a few months ago, I was given the all clear, and I am now fully fit and ready to commit myself to a good, worthy cause. And there is no cause more worthy right now than ridding Scotland of the separatist SNP government. I mentioned that I haven't previously been actively involved in politics, other than as an online analyst and an occasional blogger. But what I would say is, judging by the quality of many of the career politicians we see in Holyrood, I would say the place is in pretty desperate need of some private sector business acumen and drive. I'm sure, like many of you, I watched some of the exchanges in Holyrood with absolute horror. The standard of debate is so low at times, and the sycophantic applause from the SNP seats every time Nicola Sturgeon gives an answer just looks so staged, so fake. And you just wonder, are these people completely lacking in self-awareness? Do they not realise how badly their conduct reflects not only on themselves as individuals, but also on the Scottish Parliament as an entity and on Scotland itself? Really, it's nowhere near good enough, and there's time for something else. In terms of how I got into the Alliance for Unity, until 4 weeks ago, I genuinely had never imagined I would one day put myself forward as a candidate for Scottish Parliament. Really, it never even occurred to me. But then I began to notice a series of posts on social media from George Galloway, and he was putting forward the idea of a pro-UK alliance in Holyrood with the express intent of removing the SNP government from office. Now, this caught my attention because I'd been saying privately for some time now that a pro-UK alliance of parties was needed to take on what is very clearly a separatist alliance. And I'll talk more about the separatist alliance later. It's my view of what constitutes the modern latter-day neo-nationalist vote. In any case, so when I saw that George was saying he'd actually started an alliance of political parties in Scotland, I thought, well, I must get in touch. So we spoke, and from the start, I told George that my background is very different to his. I'm just saying this to illustrate a point, really. I'm Ulster Scots, going back many generations. I actually have family in the Unionist community in Northern Ireland, and I am one of the founders of a Rangers Football Club supporters group, which exists to help Rangers fans own shares in the club. Now, of course, those of you who live in Scotland will know that George Galloway is none of those things. So straight away, I said, okay, we have different views. But as soon as we spoke, it was notable how closely aligned we both were on the critical importance of Scotland remaining inside the UK. And George, in fact, used phrases in the first phone call, which I use myself on social media, just to describe various aspects of this. And so about 10 minutes into the call, George asked me, would you be prepared to stand? Will you stand? And I said, why not? Okay, why not? And that was it. It was as simple as that. It was an email and it was a phone call. And I thought, right, okay, I'm going to do this. And one thing straight off that interested me was the reaction from friends pretty much always went the same way. When I told them I was planning to work alongside George Galloway, a lot of them said straight away, George Galloway, sure you want to work with him? So the view they took was, his views are so different from yours, domestically and globally. How can you work with someone like that? And I said, well, I get the point, but most people then came back with, I see what you're saying, actually, because we do need someone who can take the fight to these people in Holyrood. And yeah, I see what George Galloway could do here. So now I can see where you're coming from. And a lot of people contacted me privately to wish me luck and to say, look, you're doing the right thing. We're with you, which was great and it was very heartening. And so as a result, I haven't regretted for a second the decision to stand, genuinely. And so I'm fully on board now, and I'm doing this. Now, as I say, there is no more worldly cause than retention of Scotland's place in the UK. As we slowly emerge from lockdown, that's going to be doubly so. We all know, had Scotland been made independent in 2014, we would have been forced to face this pandemic and the reaction to this pandemic while being not only out of the United Kingdom, but also out of the European Union. Scotland would have been alone. Now, there is not the slightest chance that Scotland could have afforded its own furlough scheme had it not been part of the United Kingdom. Those sums don't even begin to add up, and they simply don't. Yet there are people, senior people within the SNP, who are trying to mislead the Scottish electorate every day by saying the opposite. And just last week, Ian Blackford was interviewed on the BBC, and he was asked, doesn't the furlough scheme show that Scotland is better off in the Union? And he was clearly annoyed at the question, and his reply was the classic go-to line that separatists use when they have no answer, and that is, oh, you're saying we're too wee, too poor, and too stupid. Now, as if anyone could ever think Ian Blackford is too wee. I think not. But this is what happens when SNP figures are interviewed, invariably, particularly by English journalists. They will throw in a completely meaningless stock phrase which will put the questioner off guard or off balance. And the interview after then just becomes an unchallenged monologue. And this is why I've decided to get involved. It's one of the many reasons, because I will pose difficult questions to these people, separatists, both during the campaign and if I'm elected in Holyrood. And I won't be silenced with cliches and sound bites, which I know are just there to distract and to deflect. And I know that my Alliance for Unity colleagues won't be distracted either, and certainly not Mr. Galloway. Now, this is absolutely the time to take the fight to the separatists, to the people who want to destroy the United Kingdom at a time when to do so is economic insanity. And this is something, arguing with separatists and frankly showing them up, This is something I do on social media regularly. So if I can put this ability to better use in Holyrood, then that's exactly what I'm going to do. And that's really why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so I know that there is still some residual doubt about the fact that I'm working alongside a guy like George, given how many differences I've said. But my answer is very straightforward. I've explained why I decided to work with him. But what I would say to others is, don't be put off by the presence of George Galloway in this campaign. He's a huge part of it, but this is not the George Galloway party. He is a massive part of it, but he is just, like me, going to be a candidate in one of the regions. That's it. Now, during the campaign, there will be no discussion of any topics which are not directly related to the Scottish elections. Alliance for Unity candidates are all working together to advance a single cause, and that cause is retention of Scotland's place in the UK, plus, of course, what goes along with that, removal of the SNP government. Now, as such, I will happily stand alongside George Galloway to make the case for unity and to dismantle the separatists' strawman arguments, which is what they are. And one thing that I would add here is Alliance for Unity contains people from hugely different backgrounds, not just George, me, all of whom are united in the common cause. Now that to me shows that support for the UK is widespread in Scotland and is not confined to any one section of society. It's not. There are people right across the board, right across the entire strata of all sorts of communities in Scotland who are working together on this. And what I think that also shows is that there is this willingness, what follows on from that is this willingness to work together jointly to ensure the separatists don't succeed in breaking up the UK. And as a result, I would say this, we're, if you like, setting the example here for the pro-UK parties, the larger pro-UK parties, and we would call on them to follow our lead, agree to work together and field just one pro-UK candidate in each constituency seat, because that's the only way we'll be able to defeat the SNP government. No individual party is going to be able to do this. That's what we want those guys to do. And yes, so yes, to all the people from the same background as me, yes, I come from a different community than George. Yes, we have different views on domestic views and world views. I totally get all of that. But George Galloway is a genuine political heavyweight. Now, his involvement in this campaign in just a few weeks has invigorated the entire pro-UK Scottish electorate. You just have to look on social media to see that's the case. And already, the separatists are running scared. There's been some talk of social media troll attacks on George, which I'll pick up on later. You have to understand also that I've spoken to George many times, and he means every word he says on the vital importance of Scotland remaining in the UK. This isn't just a flight of fancy for Mr. Galloway. It's nothing of the kind. He means this to his core, believe me. He knows it's important that Scotland remains in the UK, and with his help, it's going to happen. We'll prevent the separatists from forcing Scotland out of the UK and into certain economic catastrophe. Now that's what we're going to do. And if it takes cooperation with George Galloway to ensure that happens, I consider that a very small price to pay. And I would urge everyone with a similar background to me to view it in exactly that way. So a little bit more about what we've been doing in the Alliance. Since launch, there has been incredible interest on social media. As I mentioned, the Twitter account already has overtaken the Scottish Liberal Democrats. We have over 14,500 followers now, which is quite an amazing achievement. It's also a clear sign that Scotland's voters are not frankly impressed with the existing opposition parties. And until the launch of Alliance for Unity, which, let's not forget, was only last month, there was a definite sense, a palpable sense among opposition parties of resignation that they knew what was coming. And I knew of MSPs who were openly saying, oh yeah, I'll lose my seat to the SNP, no question. Great, okay. An opinion poll that started to show a small majority in favour of independence, and it was obvious that something had to happen, something had to change in order to jolt the pro-UK parties into life, and that is exactly what the emergence of Alliance for Unity has done. Now, it's easy for me to be critical of the opposition parties, but it's far, far more germane, if you like, for me to talk about what's happening in Scotland in Holyrood with the SNP administration. And as we all saw 2 weeks ago, what we thought was a new low was reached with the introduction of Humza Yousaf's Hate, Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. This latest piece of, frankly, appalling legislation from a man who gives the impression that he would be out of his depth in a thimble is nothing more than the repealed Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, resurrected and added with additional steroids. because this, once again, incredibly, is a bill which asks Scotland's police constables to decide what behaviour constitutes free speech and what represents not simply what is offensive, but what might be considered a hate crime with a potential jail sentence of 7 years. This is a bill which genuinely could see people arrested for religious paraphernalia, like owning a Bible, perhaps. Nobody knows. There is no definition of what constitutes hate crime. It's up to arresting police officers. I mean, this is just the latest in a series of embarrassing flops from Humza, a man whose CV contains pretty much everything except a single success. Humza's personal journey, if you've watched him, has taken him previously from the coffee shops on Byres Road down to Baird's Bar on match day. Now, it seems he's reinvented himself as Holyrood's Huey Newton. This is the man who, let's not forget, while Scotland's Transport Secretary forgot to renew his own motor insurance. This is a man whose response to his cabinet colleague, SNP's Finance Secretary Derek Mackay, bombarding a schoolboy with suggestive text messages, was to tell reporters Derek's done the right thing by resigning. Great. Well, it's my feeling that Scotland deserves far, far better than this, and the Alliance for Unity has far, far better than this in Charlotte Morley, who's our Shadow Justice Secretary. Now, as if that wasn't bad enough, Humza was outdone last week by the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, if you please, and former SNP leader John Swinney. John, of course, is the man whose face has the unmistakable diffident expression of a man who knows he can't do his job. He's the man whose sole achievement in his political career is to coin the phrase, which I previously mentioned, too wee, too poor, too stupid. And that's to describe non-separatists' opposition to Scottish independence, as if we're talking Scotland down. John, relax. After all these years in Holyrood, we know you're not too poor. So I can happily clear that one up for you. Now, last week, John presented improved Scottish exam results in a year in which not one pupil sat an exam. But despite this, John was still able to reinforce the SNP's obvious flagship policy, which is ensuring university places go to fee-paying students from other countries and to the children of wealthy Scottish families. Now, why do I say that? Because children from schools in Scotland's most deprived areas have been left out. Their predicted grades have been marked down by the SQA, not by their teachers, by the SQA, at more than twice the rate of predicted grades of pupils from schools in Scotland's most affluent areas. So under John Swinney, applicants to Scotland's universities are now facing a selection process which is like an old 1980s Billy Connolly sketch, with a university admissions officer sitting in his office behind a till, credit card reader in hand, saying, right, where's this one from? London? Brilliant, he'll pay tuition fees, you're in. What about you? Where are you from? White Craigs? Well, you won't pay fees, but I'm sure we can find room for you, you're in. What about you guys? Where are you from? Paisley? Oh, Greenock? Sorry guys, I'm afraid we're full. Try again next year maybe. Now that's John Swinney's legacy. The man who handed out free university places to the children of millionaires while refusing entry to Scotland's brightest working class students. What a legacy. Judge me in education, Nicola Sturgeon insisted when she succeeded her mentor, Alex Salmond. Well, the verdict has been reached, First Minister. Guilty of failing Scotland's pupils. Resign. Take your Education Secretary with you. Scotland's pupils are, I believe, demonstrating again today, showing that they will not be silenced and they will not be told, know your place, by the SNP government. I do notice, though, that Swinney is now making a statement on Tuesday over his handling of this results fiasco. A two-word statement will do just fine, John. I resign. I could spend all night listing the sheer incompetence of SNP cabinet ministers, but frankly, we don't have that long. Well, just to touch on some of the others, Health Secretary Jean Freeman, who is supposedly spearheading Scotland's response to the pandemic, and I'm not going to politicise this in any way because that would be poor form, but let's just say Jean is trusted so much that Nicola Sturgeon personally gives a press briefing every day, so I think that says it all, really. Derek Mackay's replacement as Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, the person who told the Scottish people that £800 million of UK government aid is in fact only worth £21 million. Well, that's one hell of an exchange rate, Kate. Government Business Secretary Mike Russell, of course, who insisted only a few weeks ago that 5 million Scots pay out more to the 60 million other people in the rest of the UK than they get back. That, of course, is one of the most outrageous untruths ever perpetrated to the people of Scotland, and it is, of course, a cornerstone of SNP policy. Make false claims to the people of Scotland and hope no one notices. And I could go on all night, but really, what is the point? You all know what I'm talking about here. So it's time for a change. Now, when I go onto social media and I say, look, we need to have an alliance, a lot of people question us and say, well, don't you have that already? You have 3 pro-UK parties working together. Now, again, this isn't true. The 3 UK big parties in Scotland, the Conservatives, Scottish Labour and the Scottish Lib Dems, are too busy fighting each other in the race to finish as a distant second to the SNP. Far too busy looking after their own interests to look at the wider view. There's no sense of commonality, especially not these days when they were also bitterly divided, and still are, on issues such as Brexit. Now, if you look at each one of the 3 big parties, they're all in various states of rest. The Conservatives, of course, we know that Jackson Carlow stepped down to be replaced by Douglas Ross. But Douglas Ross has already said he's looking to form an effective opposition to the SNP. So I think that gives you quite a clear indication of the extent of Douglas's ambitions for the party. And of course, in addition, Adam Tompkins and Ruth Davidson, 2 of Hollywood's unquestionably most able politicians, are leaving next year. So the Conservatives are going through a little bit of a change there. As for Labour, well, I think we all know Scottish Party leader Richard Leonard is so low profile. He makes Howard Hughes look like a publicity junkie, and it's incredible. Seemingly, no one knows who he is, apparently, according to polls. I would be astonished if Mr Leonard leads Labour into next May's election. Really, I don't see that happening. So there's going to be changes in Labour also. And the Lib Dems, well, we got Willie Rennie. It appears that Willie Rennie is still deciding who to back in the party's internal leadership election, which is still going on incredibly. 2 people, crazy. Anyway, and it would seem also that Willie and the rest of the Lib Dems are still looking for ways to find to have Article 50 revoked. Well, good luck with that, guys. So, for the Holyrood election next May, it's essential that pro-UK voices coalesce around a single message, because single messages win elections. And that's exactly what Alliance for Unity provides. Now, this has to happen. This pro-UK alliance has to happen. Otherwise, we face an unwanted, divisive second referendum, because let's be clear, the SNP will go into next year's election along with the new, whatever they're called, the new International Party for Independence, and they will try and win as many seats as they can on a platform of going for an immediate referendum. I spoke earlier about the separatist alliance that makes up the inflated figures of support for independence today. And this is true, it is the case. The people you see voting SNP today, 10 years ago, they didn't vote SNP. They voted, but they didn't vote SNP. Some of them did, in truth. You've got the traditional Scottish nationalists, if you like, the people who still live figuratively and possibly literally in the 14th century, still fighting the Battle of Bannockburn. And then you have some of the newcomers. Mainly among these people, you've got the far left voters who hated New Labour, hated Blair, and they decided after the 2010 election, let's vote SNP. Now, these are people who are pretty much ashamed of Britain's past and who have found a new outlet for their rather strange worldviews. And that new outlet is the cause of Scottish independence. And what's bizarre about this is these are the people, the very people who previously detested nationalism and now pretend to embrace it. You take the classic example, Tommy Sheridan. Tommy, the great believer in socialism, now backs Scottish independence. What happened to the Socialist Alliance, Tommy? Does it stop when you reach Carlisle? And then you've got the new voters, the idealistic young people. We all know the type. They hate Boris Johnson, they hate Donald Trump, and they believe in a fair society in which Tory and austerity are swear words. But what these people don't realise is life after independence, as Scotland tried desperately to meet EU entry criteria, would make the days of Tory austerity look like a golden age of prosperity. Scotland's public services would be hacked as never before. And Scottish taxes, already the highest in the UK, let's not forget, would go sky high just to meet the cost of bringing down the deficit in order to meet EU entry criteria. Madness. Also, additionally, part of this neo-nationalist alliance, you have the descendants of migrants who came to Scotland some generations ago. Now, some of these people don't like to consider themselves British, but on the other hand, they don't want to sacrifice any of the benefits of being British. And we know that these people are now voting SNP. Okay. And lastly, we have the environmentalists, the people whose commitment to green issues is unshakable. so much so that they will habitually vote for a party whose economic projections are based on the extraction and production of oil, a pollutant fossil fuel. So this is what we're up against. We're up against not just the SNP as was, we're up against a group of people who have formed an alliance to bring their odd, disparate worldviews and views of the best way for Scotland to conduct itself in the future together. And that's why we have to do the same thing, because it's impossible to fight an alliance without an alliance, particularly on a binary issue. You just can't do it. The answer is either we go down the suicidal path of independence or we don't, and that's how we have to play this. So pro-UK parties simply have to agree to do something together, and that's what we're calling them to do. Only an alliance can stop this craziness from going any further. Now, on that subject, of course, you can't go into an election spouting nothing but economic facts and figures, because the great blogger Effie Deans made the point this weekend that parties in other countries seeking independence have never lost out to an argument putting forth nothing but economic facts. The only exception to that rule is possibly the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, when thankfully people realised it wasn't a good idea. But Effie's point was that the heart tends to overrule the head when it comes to the drive for nationalism and the drive for independence. But leaving aside the economics of it, speaking in purely non-economic terms for a minute, there is no question that Scotland, over the last 13 years, under the SNP administration, has become unrecognisable from the tolerant, welcoming country in which I grew up, in which most of us grew up, apart from, of course, the people who have been born and know nothing but an SNP administration. Scotland, frankly, is not the nice place it once was, and you just have to look at what's been happening lately. Fanatical protesters standing beside, on the border, next to a motorway, screaming at English motorists to go back home using appalling profanities. That's not a sight I ever thought I would see in Scotland. And I've touched on this outside of this podcast, but I feel very strongly that the lack of respect and consideration shown to elderly Scots these days is frankly appalling. And I think the care homes COVID-19 scandal shows that very clearly. And again, I don't want to politicise that in the slightest. I just think it's a very, very poor way for our elderly people to have been treated. And a little closer to home for me, last week in Scotland, news emerged that 2,000 packages, all containing the same product, which had been purchased online, had been vandalised and defaced in the process of delivery to buyers' doors. And that's 2,000 separate items. And why were they defaced? Because the packaging revealed the contents. They were this season's Rangers football shirts. And so some brave heroes took it upon themselves to damage the equipment. I mean, to damage the goods. And that gives an indication of the type of Scotland that separatists seek. A Scotland where deviation from the norm and the groupthink lead to furious verbal and sometimes physical assaults. And who can forget last year, only last year, the look of unbridled fury on the face of Nicola Sturgeon as she outlined her vision of the open, welcoming, diverse and inclusive Scotland that she seeks. Well, First Minister, I'm very sorry, we don't want it. Now, talking about online unpleasantness, those of us who lived in Scotland in the lead up to the 2014 referendum will remember the hugely unpleasant tactics used by the cybernats, as we called them. And already, as I said, George Galloway's attracted Twitter trolls with some piece of absolute filth which was posted in his direction. I know the police have been contacted after that. And earlier this week, the Alliance Twitter, and I think it's just this weekend, in fact, the Alliance for Unity Twitter account made the point that many of today's separatists, or as I call them, neo-nationalists, are looking to resurrect the Irish conflict and fight it once again on Scottish soil. Now, this is a point that's widely ignored in the mainstream media because it's rather a sensitive topic, but it's absolutely true. There are a goodly proportion of people who are now pro-Scottish independence who are from that particular community. And that's not a criticism, it's just an observation. Now, you can see this if you look at an online discussion with anybody who puts forth the view that independence is the right move for Scotland. The conversation always goes the same way. It will start with a fictional claim, something like Scotland pays more in tax than it gets back. And when that's challenged, you'll always get a disparaging reference from this nationalist to some supposed unionist icon. They'll either criticise Margaret Thatcher or Boris Johnson or Rangers Football Club or Prince Andrew. Always the same. And then you go back and say, well, actually, that's not really very pertinent to what we're discussing, and it will end with them blocking you. And that happens every day. It happens to me several times a day. Now, it's got to the stage, frankly, and there's a reason I'm mentioning this. Anyone who uses social media will recognise, if you like, the stereotypical modern-day extreme nationalist backer of separatism. Now, this is the type of person who tweets about the evil deeds of the British Empire and the crimes of UK's armed forces. He refers to occupied Scotland. He calls pro-UK Scots Yuns or Britnats or traitors. He calls the Union flag the butcher's apron. And he spends his days phoning the Daily Record hotline to complain and to put forth conspiracy theories about Scottish football. And he spends the evening phoning Radio Clyde Super Scoreboard to put forth conspiracies in Scottish football. And how does he spend his weekends? Whenever football grounds are open, he waves a PLO flag or a Basque separatist flag while he sings pro-IRA songs. That is the stereotypical pro-nationalist, pro-separatist voter. And we come across them every single day on social media. Now, that's fine if that's how you want to behave, but let's not pretend this grotesque behaviour has anything to do with Scottish identity. It doesn't. It's extremism of the worst sort, and it's people who hold these views who are backing Scottish independence in their droves. Now, without their votes, the SNP would be back to winning 2 or 3 seats every election, as they were, as we all remember them, for years. Now, ignoring the fact that there is a distorted sense, partly of Irish nationalism and partly generic anti-UK sentiment fueling many of the modern-day neo-nationalists who back independence, is not only unwise, it's actually dangerous. And this was the point that the Alliance for Unity Twitter account made. No one in their right mind wants to see heightened sectarian tension and bloody conflict taking place in Scotland. But these separatists are prepared to take that risk in what they term the struggle for independence. And that can't be allowed to happen. It just can't. We have to counter this. So I think the task facing us is a big task. I think it's a difficult task. I think while there is a lot of momentum in Alliance for Unity, and I'm delighted that it's taken off the way it has, we shouldn't underestimate the sheer scale of what we face. Sticking with the status quo can be a very difficult sell. It's not an easy thing to say. It's a difficult thing to get excited about. Conservatism, if you like, with a small c, or saying the same. The many Scottish voters we know feel a generic sense of dissatisfaction with the UK. We understand that, particularly as the current Prime Minister is probably not one who many Scots would have chosen. But as a result, it may fall on Alliance for Unity to remind voters, Scottish voters, of the many benefits of the UK and of what we would lose if the UK no longer existed. And I think it's very, very important that we learn lessons from the 2014 referendum, when at times it seemed the Better Together campaign flagged a little, and sometimes she seemed a bit short of answers when asked, well, what has the UK achieved? Now, to me, very little was said, for example, about the Scottish Enlightenment in the period in the 18th and 19th centuries, which was a time of unparalleled academic and scientific achievement in Scotland. And this was a time when, as part of a successful economic and political union with its near neighbours, Scotland truly flourished as never before and led the world in many fields in advancements. And this is the spirit that should and must come back to Scotland. This is what I would love to see returning to Scotland. We shouldn't be an inward-looking nation crippled with grievance and resentment. We should look at ways in which we can lead the way in discovery. The Scots are hard-working, industrious people. We always have been. And this is going to hold us in very, very good stead as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have to be strong. We have to try to be stronger than we were before. Now, what will definitely not help us as we emerge from this quite unprecedented time is if we choose total isolation from the rest of our partners in the world by cutting economic and political ties with our closest neighbour. And let's not forget, the country to which we export 60% of the goods we produce. To do that would be crazy. So what we must do is explain to people why we think that's not the right idea. Now, of course, talking about COVID-19, and again, I know it's to politicise this, but it has had the effect of exposing our First Minister to a wider UK audience every day. And each day, come rain or shine, Miss Sturgeon appears centre stage, positively using sincerity as she gazes into the camera to deliver what looks increasingly like a daily presidential address. And to quote Robin McAlpine, Scotland suddenly has a hacked together presidential system forcibly imposed on top of a democracy which is not designed for it. Now, how long can this go on? I mean, we are seeing really identity politics taken to the most crazy extreme. And I'm just wondering, when will the Scottish electorate take a tumble to itself, as we used to say, and as we also used to say in Glasgow, understand the using they're being handed every single day by this increasingly bizarre and rather peculiar couple, Mr. and Mrs. Peter Morrell, respectively the Chief Executive Officer and the leader of the SNP, Scotland's governing party. Since when did the Scottish electorate become so deferential? And it baffles me. I genuinely don't see it going on. And I hope that some sanity will come back to the Scottish political scene. And I hope very much that's what we bring. So I'm not sure exactly how long I've been talking, but I think you've probably heard just about enough for now. So I'll wrap up. Can I just ask that you please follow Alliance 4, that's 4, Unity on Twitter. Please also follow me. I'm Erudite Unionist. I'd ask you please, just as I leave you, to bear in mind what I've said, particularly to those of you who share my worldview and other matters. These are extraordinary times, and in such times, you need to take actions which maybe you wouldn't normally consider. And also, lastly, the last thing I would say, for any of you who have maybe toyed with the idea of backing independence and have said, what's the worst that could happen? Believe me, there's a very lengthy list of terrible things that could and would happen if Scotland ever became independent. And I've hopefully pointed some of them out to you today. Thank you for listening, everyone, and I look forward to engaging with you further in the coming weeks and months.